Hi, welcome. This is Peter Calabrese. I'm the CEO of Can-Am Investor Services. Can-Am is the FINRA registered broker-dealer of Can-Am Enterprises, one of the largest and certainly most successful regional centers in the history of the EB-5 program. I had the great pleasure today of being joined by Mr. Mike Zenik. Mike is the Senior Managing Director of Invest America, and he's a principal at Sequence Financial. Mike runs another broker dealer operating in the EB5 program, and we have the great pleasure today of having him to talk a little bit about compliance in the EB5 program, especially as it pertains to this very specific security that it is, and as it pertains to the marketing and potentially investing in these investment options by clients who we both deal with. Mike, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pete. Pleasure to be with you.
Well, thank you so much. So Mike, I think we're just going to dive right in on this because you and I, we overlap in a lot of the operational types of things that we do our brokers. But I think that these are things that maybe the everyday investor who's looking at EB5, especially for the first time, doesn't necessarily see as happening. But these are operations and these are processes that are vitally important, both from the integrity of our businesses, but also for the end client and making sure that they are making the correct investment decision in this very unique security that they're looking at. So a few of the things that we're going to touch on today is just the growing role of broker dealers, how EB5 due diligence is completed, and why it's important. And then just some of the obligations that an investor should be aware of, and the best practices that are taken into account by projects that are working on these. I would also take it as a moment just to say that we are actually also drafting a white paper on a lot of these topics that we are very pleased to have you participating on. So, in addition to this webinar that we are so happy that you have tuned in on, that you're going to be able to read or listen to, we're going to have that white paper available for people soon. So, Mike, thank you for joining us for this, and thank you for participating in that.
Absolutely. Very excited about that. So I think it's an important uh, focus that people need to learn more about.
Awesome. Well, so Mike, maybe if you could just start us off here, and I think what's important is just from a baseline standpoint that EB5, even though it is a very unique security, it is a security, and there are different compliance aspects that go along with it. So maybe if you could just talk through maybe the growing role that broker dealers in this very unique security are playing, and the protection that that provides to investors as they are going through and making these decisions.
Absolutely. So as a broker dealer and having been in the EB5 space since 2012, we've definitely seen an evolution of the role of broker dealers and an evolution of the industry in general, which it basically it's an area that really needs to be even more focused on. I think the thing that investors don't necessarily realize when they're evaluating these things, they're looking at as a conduit to a green card, and a lot of them just are focused on that piece of it. They're not so much focused on this is a private security that is your capital is 100% at risk. Um, it's a lot of money that you're putting at risk. It's certainly a life changing opportunity for you and your family to be able to invest and access the green card if the investment and the project is successful. But it is very important to understand that you know uh, it's not just the marketing sheet that you get on that a regional center will give you, because a lot of times they're not highlighting the risks involved. That's on the investors. That's the investor's obligation to read the offering documents. And having dealt with hundreds of investors over the last 12 years, 13 years, it's clear that a lot of times they don't focus on that. So we've been very focused on making sure that, hey, there's lots of great benefits to this investment, but there's also risks that you need to be aware of. And we also, kind of take that into consideration when we're evaluating which projects to represent.
Hmm.
As you know, that we go through very rigorous due diligence process, as does your broker dealer, when evaluating which projects to represent and which developers to represent, which investment structures. So there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that the risks are mitigated, but there are definitely risks that I think investors need to be more focused on. And that's what we really do is our team of sales representatives that are financial securities representatives. They're trained to introduce opportunities, investment opportunities to investors, and to make sure that they understand that this is an illiquid investment. It's 100% at risk. And yes, there are benefits, and we can show them the difference, in what each of the options that we provide will give them, but also what risks are may be involved, including conflicts of interest and other things like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Vitally important. There's so many aspects that go into a successful investment in an EB5 structure. And, having someone to be able and being able to understand those as a client is supremely important. I guess an important distinction to make as well is that, Can-Am Investor Services, we are a FINRA registered broker dealer. We do all the due diligence on our projects and we represent them to clients. Sequence or Invest America does as well. With, I guess, a pretty important distinction being that CAM will only be representing the projects that are being sponsored by CAM Enterprises. We are a dedicated broker dealer of that group. Whereas the group that you work for, you have the ability to represent different projects and to be able to offer them. That doesn't change the suitability assessment that is required of either of us in making sure that the investment that we are offering is a suitable one and will meet the needs and the characteristics of each investor, and as well as the different risk profiles. I mean, generally speaking, though, like all of these investments are at risk, and they definitively need to have the potential for loss or gain. I think what we always try to, and I think what the role of a broker dealer helps to do, is to fully educate and fully make all those risks aware and remind investors that even though this does need to be an at-risk investment, it doesn't need to be overly risky. It needs to meet the level of risk that you are comfortable in taking, which I think is always important for clients.
Absolutely, absolutely, and as you know, there was a new SEC rule imposed on broker dealers about 6 years ago called Regulation Best Interest, which replaced suitability. And the way we view that is, as you mentioned, we represent multiple EB5 investment opportunities at the same time to give investors a variety, and we're not affiliated with any of those projects. We're an independent broker dealer, to draw the distinction that you made earlier. And when we're looking at an individual investor who fills out a customer information form for us, we're taking the characteristics that they've documented and matching that up with, call it 3 or 4 offerings in our portfolio that we think best suit them. Because at the end of the day, we have to demonstrate to FINRA when they come and do their audits, their regular audits of our broker dealer, we need to justify, why was this investment in this investor's best interest? It's a little easier in the EB5 side because these investors are coming in with their main goal of making these investments is to ultimately achieve the green card. So that helps us in that best interest association, but it goes kind of a little further, beyond that too, to say, well, hey, this, you're representing this project, and this investor seems from their answers were very conservative, and you let them invest into this thing that is, of all the things in your portfolio, is probably the riskiest. Why did you do that? So we have to be able to answer those questions, and that's not necessarily the wrong answer, but could be the right answer because of the conversations that our individual reps have with their investor leads. But it's really about each individual investor, their individual situation, and not just hey, let's get as many investors in as we can and just throw them into any deal. It's really it's really got to be focused on them and making sure that we're doing the right thing for them.
Absolutely. And this level of care ultimately leads to better outcomes for the investors as well. And, making sure that these different aspects of what they are looking to achieve are being documented and they are being cared for is of huge importance as well. And it's something that, transparency and suitability assessments for investors are what hopefully gets them to the outcome that they're looking to achieve. And I guess speaking of transparency, the Reform and Integrity Act that was passed in 2022 brought just a ton of benefits to the investors and brought a ton of benefits to the industry itself in terms of increased due diligence, in terms of transparency, starting with but not limited to, I mean, the fact that now every investor that goes through has to have sign off on documentation that they're aware of all the different counterparties that are involved in their investment and what their role is, defining those, if those people are receiving fees, what sort of, conflicts there might be or different aspects that could bring complications to an investment. So all of these things are hugely beneficial. But maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of the RIA, the heightened due diligence, transparency that it's brought, as well as maybe how this has affected marketing practices for these EB5 investments.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. I mean, we were pushing many years with other industry groups to get more integrity measures implemented. For so long the EB5 market was sort of deemed as a super high risk, in some cases fraudulent, type of arena, which we all know that that's not true. That wasn't true, on the whole. But obviously, you have some high profile situations, and that tends to, blanket the whole industry. But we knew that the industry needed some guardrails, it needed some protections, needed some ways to really kind of have the entire industry perform and act like a broker dealer would. Have the regional centers be focused on protecting the investor, be focused on disclosure. So we've been very happy with that. It's a fight that we've been able to kind of back off from a little bit because it's there, and that's something that we certainly reiterate. I mean, it hasn't really changed how we do due diligence because we've always done comprehensive due diligence, but I think it makes investors a lot more aware as we're talking to them. Whether it's they hear it from others that they've seen in the industry, if they're in WhatsApp groups or WeChat groups or whatever, they're hearing about these things and they want to know what due diligence did you do. So it's been nice to be able to have those conversations with investors. It certainly has affected how things have done or what we've done on the marketing side as well. Again, our marketing has always been focused on providing all the information that an investor needs, including highlighting, maybe not highlighting, but certainly including the risks involved. You see a lot of marketing materials go out and there's, kind of lists all the benefits, but there's nowhere that somebody says, hey, by the way, there's some risks as well. So we've been certainly encouraged by that. I think that, the other area that RIA has really focused on or driven volume to is more investors being located in the United States.
Absolutely.
And, marketing offshore is significantly different than marketing onshore. And sometimes those lines get blurred, especially if you've got, talking to the parents in the native country and the students here in the United States. Is it a Reg D? Is it a Reg S? Are you marketing to the family, outside the United States, or are you marketing to the investor inside the United States? So those are challenges that I think the industry has maybe not fully understood yet, and it's a challenge for us as we're trying to deal with our compliance group and with our other consultants. Okay, how do we treat this? So we've kind of basically said, let's just treat it as if it's, there's no, we're not trying to make a distinction. We're going to say we're going to treat them all as Reg D, which then changes the game on what you can say, how you can say it, what the investor needs to provide, accreditation issues, those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the working through a broker dealer and being from the stance that we are, it really does. It requires a higher level of diligence and a higher level of care. And if nothing else, that's part of the reason to go out there is that this higher level of care is what helps to get the better outcomes for people. But there's a lot of things that go into it, and sometimes we get questioned on that. It's like, well, how come we can't just do this or we can't just do that? I said, well, because there are frameworks in place and there are larger compliance aspects that need to be complied with, because EB5 is a very small part of the investment world, obviously the traditional investment world, but private placements are not. They are very well defined and very well regulated aspects, and securities within the United States are as well. So, maybe talk a little bit more about some of the marketing aspects that might come into play, because, for me, I guess the better way to define it is, there are ways in which groups can go out and compliantly talk about multiple parts of this investment, whether it's just basic educational content or basic informational content that people are discussing. And then there are much more specific securities types of conversations that might be happening, real defined talks about an actual project, which, if done correctly, is allowable as well. But there are different parts of this that need to be complied with in order to do both of those. And you certainly, there have always been these sorts of guardrails in place from a security standpoint. And I think that the having broker dealers involved shines more of a light on some of these different aspects that need to be complied with.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that we've been ultra careful in training our team to make sure that, and because our team markets both when they're here in the United States. Most of them, all except for one of our reps, actually lives in the U.S. One of them lives overseas in Turkey. So he's got to deal with a little bit of also how does he need to operate in Turkey, with Turkish securities law. So that's another thing that we don't need to get into, but it's certainly a consideration that we have to think about. But also when our reps travel and they are overseas and they are, offshore, they are talking to investors, they've got to, uh, again, sort of straddling that border
Mm-hmm.
consideration is difficult. So we really focus on training them to make sure that they understand what they should be doing. The challenges also come through in how specifically with marketing inside the United States, whether, and I don't want to get too technical, but whether an offering is being marketed under 506B or 506C, which I
Exactly.
know Can-Am has been 506B,
Yep.
which is kind of, I would call it the more sort of traditional way that private securities have been marketed, which has different requirements of know your customer requirements, different accreditation um, uh, you know requirements, whereas 506C is a little more kind of out there, and which seems to be a freer way of doing it, but it's also a lot more exposure for the broker dealer, a lot more exposure for the issuer, and I think the investor, protecting the investor is also more difficult because they see a lot of things flying around, and a lot of the marketing that I've seen has been from non-broker dealers, has been non-compliant. I would be, if FINRA and the SEC sort of just focused on EB5 marketing in the United States, and that's all they focused on for, call it a 6-month study. I'd be I'd be interested to see what they see, because I see it every day, and as I'm sure you do too.
Hmm.
Again, the focus really needs to be on the investor, making sure that they are that the information that's being put out there is accurate, and also that it's consistent with what's in the offering documents. You can't, by law, you can't say things, you can't say extra things that can't be backed up by what's in the material things anyway.
Yep.
That can't be backed up by what's in the offering document, what's in the private placement memorandum or other offering documents. So that is also a little bit of a challenge when you're having a conversation with an investor, to not, because our sales team, as your sales team does too, their goal is to sell. So their success is based on whether or not an investor invests or not.
Hmm.
So there's always that challenge of, okay, I know I got to do things the right way, but I also want to make sure that this investor comes in. So it's a balancing act, especially for a broker dealer, because we've got bigger, uh, I guess we've got more eyes on us than the regional center or other groups that don't. So it's a challenge for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, and thank you for that. So I guess a couple of things when you look at this, and because we've talked now a bunch about this and the benefits and the transparency that comes from broker deals and all these things that prove to be beneficial for the investor. But I guess what would you say some of the top compliance obligations are that investors should be aware of before they actually, make they actually wire that money into the account? I mean, when they finalize this investment and they move forward, what are some of the things that we would hope that a client would come away from and saying that, while every project is a little bit different, people structure their things differently, that would be a benefit and a real, or that the clients should know before that they actually they move their capital into making and finalizing investment.
Sure. We've talked about them being aware of the risks for sure, that they could lose all their money. I think it's also important for them to understand the group that they're investing with. That they're going to ultimately be their partner for the next 3 to 7 years, depending, or maybe longer, depending on the situation. I think we're um, we've certainly encountered a lot of investors that want to just get the thing done, and they don't want to necessarily learn about the project, learn about the offering, learn about the terms. So we really encourage them to truly understand what they're getting themselves into. And one of the challenges we also have is with students, because typically the parents are the ones, in those cases, they're gifting them the money. They're the ones that are having the majority of the conversations. And the investor, being a student, doesn't have a whole lot of investment experience. And it's we're challenged a little bit too by knowing that, hey, our client is that student, um, is that 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old student. And yes, conversations with the investor's parents is what's really kind of getting the investment across the finish line. But our allegiance, so to speak, needs to do with the investor themselves. So really helping in situations like that and others, making sure that the investor truly knows what they're getting themselves into, set expectations. Okay, when you make this investment, what happens next? Where does their money go? Making sure that they know that their money is going into an account, and when is it going to be transferred into the project, which determines when they're going to start earning interest, and when their money truly is at risk. So those are things that we really want to make sure they understand. Then over the course of the investment, what should they expect? Communication from the regional center, or the issuer, and some expectation if and when they're going to be receiving interest payments, making sure that they've got a good connection and a good group to, or a good contact person that they can connect with if they've got a question. Obviously, a lot of times they come back to us and say, I haven't heard from so and so in 6 months, and they won't answer my emails. So we will help them make those connections. So and then ultimately, when can I expect for how long is the immigration process going to take? And those are questions that we can't answer. I don't think anybody can answer those questions
Right.
in this environment. But really making sure that they kind of have a checklist
Yeah.
of all the things that they're going to that they should be aware of, and everything that they should expect from the issuing company that they invested in. That's just why we're a majority of our the investments in our portfolio are groups like Pan Am that have done this multiple times. They know what they're doing. They've got a strong track record of being transparent with the investors, being communicative with the investors, and making sure that they're going to get their questions answered. And also ultimately knowing that, and I think this is where the broker dealer is different. A broker dealer like ours is different, say, than an agent, which is, most agents will say, okay, we got you in, I got my fee, and sayonara. Whereas we've got an obligation to that investor from the moment they invest, actually before they invest, until the time that they have a return of capital. And if they have a bad outcome, then we have to sort of be there to not necessarily help them, but really just kind of be their advocate, and know that they are our client for the duration of the investment. So
Yes.
we take that seriously and really believe that we've been able to help people even in very difficult situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's just it's important to understand the role that a group plays, that a group like a broker dealer plays, and especially how important this is. I mean, and most predominantly for investors who are based in the U.S., which is happening more and more for people to just understand why the presence of a broker dealer is really that vital, or a registered rep. And I think that that's very important. And all the care that you guys put into it as well is just necessary in terms of guiding people through this process. Um, so I guess now that we look at that and what the investors should be aware of, and why they could use this sort of presence, maybe talk a little bit about the best practices that, say, you guys work through, talking about ours, in terms of ensuring that proper oversight has been happening, and that you are able to then offer these suitable investment opportunities to people.
Sure. We are, um, our best practices have evolved over the years. Um, and we've also done things to make it more seamless to the investor, make it more efficient to the investor also. So best practices for us is, it starts with due diligence, and not just we can do we can do all the legal due diligence we want to, read all the documents, and we actually we farm that out to a third party that is experienced in reviewing private placements on the EB5 side, because we want to make sure that we're looking at it with a really scrutinizing eye, somebody that doesn't have any skin in the game with whether we accept or reject an offering. So we've gone from an internal review, which we still do, but an all internal review, I guess, to adding an external group that really looks at things independently. Um, and then from there, once we decide, okay, we're going to onboard this project, we then put together a kind of a comparison chart for the investors to be able to look at, so they can compare apples to apples, and not just have a bunch of different marketing flyers that they've got to sift through, offering documents that they've got to sift through. We sort of boil it down to, and we've actually created a document that shows 40 different factors that they can compare right, you know, column by column right next to, uh, you know, each project right next to each other, so they can see what does capital stack would look like. What's the you know, term? What's the return? What's the collateral? You know, if there is any. What's the exit strategy? All those kinds of things. So we really try to, you know, help them understand those things. And then, you know, the other best practice I think that we've really been focused on is making sure that the investor, as I mentioned before, understands the risks, and we make it a point to again, not really harp on them, but certainly make them aware of it. Um, and then from a marketing perspective, uh, we used to send out, you know, a flyer that the group would bring to us, and a lot of times when we submitted that to our compliance department, they'd like rip it apart and say, you can't say this, you can't say that, you can't say that. So we spent so much time reconfiguring a regional center's marketing piece that we just decided to not do that anymore,
Hmm.
because it created, number one, too long of a time frame for us to be able to deal with it, and you know, we don't have some big marketing department that's sitting there, you know, compiling things. So we rely on the offering documents for that comparison chart that I mentioned to you, and
Hmm.
because particularly with the well-known regional centers, you know, these lots of investors kind of see the marketing out there a lot, especially once they get focused on it. Um, so that's another sort of best practice that we have done. Um, and then, you know, I think the other thing for us is we have our team has grown, and we want to make sure that each of them have different expertise that they're focused on different parts of the world. But we make sure that they're all consistently um, doing things consistently. So we have biweekly calls with them. We have strategy meetings where we're getting together and saying, okay, we're going to be approaching, you know, how we sell this way, or we're going to approach how we communicate with investors on these particular topics this way. So everything's, you know, at least our goal is to be consistent across all of our reps to make sure they understand um, that um, you know, the important things that investors need to know, and say it consistently across all of our reps. Because our team now is at 8 people, and we're getting ready to add 2 or 3 more people. So,
Hmm.
you know,
Right.
as it continues to grow, you know, that will. And then I think the other best practice that we've really done is as I mentioned before, we've automated a lot of things, making the investor onboarding process as seamless as possible, so they can, you know, we can get to know them better. We can, and that get to know starts with our sales rep. Um, the the investor form comes to me for review. I help, you know, the rep make any comments or follow up on any specific things that need to be followed up on, and then it ultimately goes to our managing principal for final sign off. Um, in situations where, again, there's a student, we make sure that, I know you guys do the same thing, that we get a purchaser representative form filled out, making sure that, you know, yes, the investor has no experience or limited experience, and they're relying on somebody else. We want to make sure that that's documented. Um, and because it's important to show that, yes, somebody else helped them, and here's how, you know, that was demonstrated. So there are things like that, processes and and automation that we've very um, deliberately and slowly created to implement to help our practice be consistent across all of our reps, and to be able to, you know, add more and more protections to the investor.
Awesome. And yeah, you see me nodding my head through the entire of this, and because this is a great rundown and a great education for everyone. But I mean, these are the things that we are doing as well, and you know, because there is a certain standardization of working with a broker dealer. But I would say, you know, and every broker dealer might have, you know, small, you know, different processes and things that they go through. But at its most basic level, groups like ours, like yours. I mean, we need to do we need to do the homework, and we need to work on the project. We need to make sure that we do all of our homework on the investor. We need to make sure that and both these things are paired off. From the investor side of it, establishing that they're an accredited investor, establishing what their tolerance is, establishing what they need to get from this, making sure that what is being offered to them is a suitable investment, and that they understand the risks that go into it as well as the benefits that go into this, and having everything be fair and balanced in our representation of it, from its marketing all the way down to our conversations with them, all the way through walking them through the finalization of an investment. And then from the actual security standpoint of it, again, to make sure that doing all of your due diligence, reviewing audits, reviewing third-party reports, from a financial standpoint, exit strategies, comparisons of markets, to make sure that the financials of it are sound and reasonable, as well as the immigration benefits of it. What the status is of the TEA that the project might be located in, what the status is of the project filing itself, not to mention the regional center and the success of that has gone into it. So all of these things are just hugely important parts of making sure that the right projects are being presented to people, and that the investors fully understand what they are getting into, which is a benefit to any investor that's coming and looking at the EB-5 program, but specifically required and necessary for U.S.-based investors. So, I think, as you alluded to before, I think that the Reform and Integrity Act really brought just fantastic improvements and benefits to the industry. Uh, Many of these things were being done by groups like ours already, the transparency and the due diligence, but it really does. It the fact that those requirements have kind of dovetailed into one of the things that the broker dealers do really speaks to the level of importance that having a broker dealer involved in these types of transactions brings.
Absolutely, 100% agree. I think there are other groups that aren't broker dealers that have really done a good job, I think, of kind of adopting a lot of those things that a broker dealer would do. I know that there's one other group that's gone on to get their own broker dealer. There's a couple of groups that you and I both know of that are contemplating a regional centers meeting, that are contemplating going to start or buy a broker dealer to be so I think the broker dealer model, as far as again doing things to make sure that the investor is protected, is really something we've been trying to we focus on ourselves, obviously, but we think the industry would be well suited to continue to use broker dealers, either a captive one like yours or an independent one like ours, really to continue to legitimize the EB-5 world as a legitimate and growing component of the U.S. capital markets. It will never be you know uh, some of as big as some of the other parts of the capital market, but it's a very important one because it's a job creation mechanism. It's a and it's economic development, from not just job creation but also bringing people into the United States that are going to add to the U.S. economy. They're going to own businesses. They're going to hire more people on their own when they start their own businesses. They're going to pay taxes. I mean, all those things that are important to improving and growing the U.S. economy. So I think getting the U.S. Getting the EB-5 world or EB-5 industry to the point where the best practices that you and I have are adopted or implemented by the rest of the industry, either again via broker dealer or starting their own, is really important to continued growth of the and really to kind of convincing because it's at the end of the day it's a program that Congress has to approve of, and if they don't approve of it, then we don't have an industry anymore. So it's one of those things that we're a little different than sort of the rest of the capital markets are market driven. People invest or they don't. Ours is certainly driven by that, but its existence is reliant on us proving and continuing to demonstrate to Congress that it's a worthwhile program. And adding all the things that the RIA did was, a great step forward.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that that was very well said and perfectly described in terms of the role. And yeah, I mean, as we kind of wrap things up a little bit here, Mike, is there anything else that you'd like to pass along to people? I think we've given a lot of information for folks to look at, to contemplate, and really kind of describe why, groups like ours are so vitally important in the securities transaction.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say is, I mean, I agree with that 100%. And the only other thing I would say is, I think the investors um, should continue to focus on groups that have experience, that have good track records, that are, and if they're talking to a regional center, ask those questions. Do you have processes and procedures in place? Do you have somebody that's going to be my contact for the duration of the investment? Give me some examples of how you're going to, keep me updated, periodically. Um, is there, and what are the risks? Ask, so, what are the risks? I know that they're in the PPM, but tell me, a lot of that's just legal stuff. Tell me the actual risks of the investing. What could go wrong?
Right.
I think I would really encourage, because everybody's going to know what the benefits are. Everybody's going to communicate that to you as an investor, but nobody's going to really, unless you really dig yourself and really ask, nobody's going to tell you what the actual risks are. So focus on that, in addition to the benefits. Um, so those are sort of the parting things I would say to an investor. And know, again, groups like Pete's and ours are focused on that. We are investor centric because we have to be, number one, and because it really is the impetus of our business, and how we operate on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for participating in the white paper as well. I think that's going to be a tremendous resource, as will this video for people. Thank you all for joining, and I hope this is helpful for you. Please feel free to reach out to myself or to Mike for more information, and we look forward to hearing from you all in the future. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Pete.